Welcome back to another Village Torah session. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and we are joined by our summer rabbinic fellow, Emily. Hello, Emily.
Hello, everybody.
Yes, so this is actually very exciting. It's the very first in the entire Village Torah series. We are outside. It's a gloriously gray day, and we are doing something that we have done once before. We're continuing in that vein, something we had done 3 weeks ago, which is highlights.
Yep.
Torah portion highlights. And the format is that Emily, our summer rabbinic fellow, is going to share 3 of her highlights from this week's Torah portion, while yours truly will share 3 of my own. And this week's Torah portion is Balak. Now, Balak is a very curious Torah portion. Right, Emily?
Yeah, I'd say that's about right.
And it really is, how shall I say, unparalleled. It is really quite different. There is nothing else like it.
Yeah, it also interrupts a story that has nothing to do with it.
Yes, it really comes out of left field. Very quite different as far as, the stories being told. So with that, I think we're going to roll right into it. Emily, what are your highlights in this week's Torah portion of Balak?
So my highlights for this week's Torah portion, I have 3 of them. The first one is the way in which God speaks through our various people in this week's Torah portion. So Balaam is a prophet or magician, lots of different translations, is sent by King Balak of Moab to go curse the Israelites. But God, and I'm oversimplifying here a little bit just for the sake of time, but God puts different words in his mouth. God puts the words of a blessing in his mouth. And so every time that he goes to try and curse the Israelites, instead he ends up blessing them, because this power outside of himself, or I guess that depends on your theology, that power, God, is putting those words into his mouth for him. And I found that was interesting. There's also a talking donkey that's related to that. Another part that I like that is actually related to the part I just said is, so the words Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov are in this week's portion, and those might sound a little bit familiar to you from services on really any morning service, probably Shabbat morning services, if you've heard them. And that...
It's also, I've seen it on synagogues, whether on walls or elsewhere within the sanctuary. It's a very commonly referenced verse to talk about special Jewish places.
Yes, absolutely. And that verse is the verse that comes out of Balaam's mouth when he sees the tents of Jacob. It literally means, "How wondrous are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel." My third highlight is all of the animals that pop up in this week's Parsha. Now we're getting to the talking donkey.
Wow.
So the first one that pops up is Balaam's talking donkey. So when Balaam is on his way to try and curse the Israelites, the donkey stops. He actually veers off to the side and then stops, because there's an angel in their way. Of course, the donkey knows this, but Balaam does not.
And not just any angel. An angel with a sword drawn, ready for battle.
Yes, which the donkey can see somehow. And the donkey cries out, "Why are you hitting me? Why? Like, there's something in my way. I can't go that way." And first of all, Balaam's a little confused because donkeys don't generally talk. And then he realizes that there's an angel there, because the angel reveals himself to Balaam. We also see some animals in the section of Balaam's oracles towards the Israelites, one of which is a lion roaring up to take over the animals around it. It doesn't really specify what it's taking over. And so I found 2 different interpretations of this. One of them said, and I think it was Ibn Ezra, said that this was a reference to the immediate success of the Israelites right before they entered the land of Canaan. But Rashi says, in a little more of a zoomed out way, that this is about getting up every morning to do the daily mitzvot. which are two extremely different interpretations. But I thought it was really interesting that those things could both be interpreted from the same verse.
Great.
So those are my highlights.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing those three highlights. For me, my three highlights, the first of which is how different this, we talked about, this is just such a very different parasha, very different Torah portion. And one of the things for me that is so incredibly fascinating is we've been so fixated in this book on all the challenges, all the troubles, all the contesting of Moses and the various strivings and troubles and challenges. And then it's almost like the camera then switches scenes. It's a different mise en scène, as it were. It's a different, we've been so focused on the Jews and their contentiousness. I know, Jews arguing, never. But then it totally shifts. We get these Gentiles, we get Balak and Bilam. And what's really fascinating actually for me is to see how concerned they are. I mean, overall, if you were to think about it, is how successful these Jews have been. Meanwhile, it's funny, internally we see all these rifts, all these challenges. In recent weeks, we have seen Korach, all those 250 leaders who rose up against Moses. We saw, in last week's Torah portion, we saw the Mei Merivah, the waters of contention incident. There have been all these fighting, and they say, oh, just kill us, let's just die. But meanwhile, we have this external view as a threat from this other nation. They view the Jews as a threat, the Am Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael, the Israelites as a mortal threat to them, and they say, look, maybe physically we can't do anything, but let's. So King Balak says, oh, I know a guy. He seeks out Bilam, and he throws so much material goods at him. I mean, if we were to think about all the different animals at all the different altars that he sacrifices multiple times. I mean, it's not one attempt, it's 3 attempts.
Yes.
So much being used in the efforts at trying to, we can call curse the Israelites, we can say spiritually defeat them, or otherwise throw hexes upon them, whatever it is. All these efforts are being put into defeating them from afar, not engaged in physical battle. So I find this really fascinating as far as switching the lens to get this external view, and it's a very subjective view too.
Yes.
It's very out of deep concern. So that's number one. That's for me one highlight. It's a very different view. So number two, there's no way of avoiding talking about the talking donkey in this week's Torah portion. Yes, I think many of us may be familiar with talking donkeys from Shrek movies, but we're not used to it being in the Bible. Now, I don't even know what to do with it. I mean, there's no way of just ignoring or otherwise sidestepping talking donkeys, being scared by sword-drawn angels in their way. I mean, it's hard to ignore. And to be honest, it's a fascinating piece, and I honestly have no idea what to do with it. That having been said, I think especially the rationalists amongst us can take solace or at least something that resonates with them as far as the way that Maimonides, Rambam, deals with this. He says, look, this didn't actually happen. This isn't a recording of what really went down. This is a vision. It may have just been a dream, that this didn't really actually happen this way. And he actually, we have this angel with the sword drawn, ready for battle in front of the donkey. But we also have angels in other places. It doesn't occur so much, certainly not in the book of Numbers. It's almost more frequent in the book of Genesis.
Yes.
So, for instance, Abraham, or Avram at the time, welcomes 3 angels. Well, that's another incident where Rambam says, or Maimonides says, that didn't really happen. It wasn't really angels. It was just some sort of vision. Maimonides is not really keen on these angels, whatever they may be, these sort of supernatural beings. And he's certainly not comfortable with that in this week's Torah portion. And that's how he explains it away. He says it was some sort of vision. It was some sort of, maybe just a dream. It didn't actually happen because it's just so fantastical. And that's the way he explains it away. So for those of a more rationalist bent looking to understand that aspect in this week's Torah portion is something there for you as far as a way of how do you even deal or otherwise integrate this story into our understanding how it works into the Torah portion. So that's number 2. Number 3 is what happens afterwards. I mentioned at the outset, my first highlight is that we finally get to see the shift of camera angle going from the Israelites to this other nation that's very deeply concerned, very scared of the Israelites approaching. But what happens when we take that camera and shift it back to the Israelites? We get the Israelites fornicating with some other people, and they're bowing down to their gods, and then there's this whole plague that kills out thousands of people. So it's so funny, like we get, as Emily mentioned, Ma tovu ahalecha Yaakov, we get this lovely verse praising the Jews, praising the Israelites, all these great, wonderful things, and we shift the camera back and they're engrossed in some terrible misfortune that is also, maybe of a spiritual nature also. They're bowing down to foreign gods, and thousands of them are killed out because of this incident. So it's clearly challenging. I mean, look, the entire book of Numbers is so deeply fascinating with all these leadership challenges and infighting amongst the Israelite people. But even for a brief moment in this week's Torah portion, we get an outside perspective. While they are physically threatened and very deeply concerned about the threat that the Israelites pose to them, at the same time, they're inadvertently praising and blessing the Jewish people. So it's a really wonderful, going in a very different direction, a really different perspective, which is fresh, even if we are then, pulled back down into the deep divisions amongst the Israelites. So for me, those are my three highlights. You have any thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, obviously we know that things don't end up so great for the Israelites in the next couple of chapters. So it's very interesting. I didn't think about that contrast, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's Torah portion discussion, the Village Torah presentation. Again, this is the second time we've done it, having previously done it 3 weeks prior. We hope you enjoyed this style of presentation, and please let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you, and we want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.